All right, guys, so welcome back to class. I'm so excited to see all of you. And as we always do, I'm going to start with our student objectives for this particular lesson. I want you guys to know what it is that you're going to accomplish every time you come into class and you watch our videos and do the activities that are mentioned inside of Schoology. So the expectations for this lesson is that you guys will know the purpose of an ode and how it gives meaning to poetry. You're also going to be able to understand definition poems and how they contribute to the overall meaning. And you will be able to create or write your own ode and incorporate sensory and descriptive words. And I'm going to just change this word to write just because that's me. It has to say what activity we're going to actually be doing. So you are going to be able to write your own ode and incorporate sensory and descriptive words. And we've been talking about sensory and descriptive words, so I think we're almost ready for that challenge. So the first thing that we're going to start off with, guys, is we're going to compose an ode. So I want you to pick an object for your ode. So when you remember when we talked about an ode, we said that an ode is a type of poem that is used to praise or show admiration to a particular object or thing or someone. So if you have your book, you will remember that there was an ode inside of our book, okay? And we talked about that before, and that ode was on page 33, Ode to My Hair. And in that ode, he showed a deep admiration and love and like for his hair, okay? So that's going to be here in your book, The Crossover, page 33. So you're going to use this as an example to guide you. Now, I've written an example of my own ode, and I also chose my hair because I know for me, I love hair. I like to switch it up a lot and do different styles, and that's something that's really important to me. So I chose my hair, and I wrote, if my hair were a rainbow, because when you go into your ode, you will notice that in the first line of page 33, he says, if my hair were a tree. So he's comparing his hair to another object. So if my hair were a rainbow, I'd follow it. I'd treat it like treasure and shine it. And I chose this because with the rainbow, a lot of people like to follow the rainbow to get to the end because hopefully there's a treasure. And at the end of that treasure, you're supposed to be able, or when you get to the treasure, you're supposed to be able to find shiny coins and things that are of value, right? So this is an example of what I've composed for my ode. You don't have to do hair. It could be anything that you have a deep love and admiration for, because remember, that's what an ode is. So once again, we're going to focus on our focusing question and our content framing question. So our focusing question again is, what shapes Josh Bell's sense of himself and his world? And right now we're going to be in our reveal stage, where we say, what does a deeper exploration of character reveal in the crossover? So we're going to begin examining these factors and understanding what shapes Josh's identity. In order to do this, guys, we're going to start off with a quick exercise. I want you to write down a relationship that is very important to you, and then explain how this relationship has helped shape your sense of self and the world around you. And then you're going to drop it down in the discussion board. So this is my example. So the directions here are telling you to write about a relationship that is important to you. And then you're going to explain how that relationship has helped shape your sense of self and the world around you. So the relationship that I picked was me and my mom. So I said, the relationship with my mom is very important to me. This relationship helps shape my sense of self and the world around me in many ways. For example, having such a close relationship to my mom, it made me really value education because she spoke about how important it was to have. She was a principal and retired this year. Seeing her go and get her master's degree and her doctorate degree made me want to really pursue higher education and teach as well. As a person now, I can honestly say I value education and teaching others because I got this from my relationship and the examples that my mom showed me. It showed me hard work because I saw how hard she had to study and stuff to complete school. And it showed me how hard work and working for what you want in life can open you up to many opportunities. So, I want you to think of a relationship that is very important to you. And I want you to write a paragraph similar to this inside of the discussion board. If you need a moment to do that, please pause here and then we'll see you right back. So, let's reread Josh Bell, which is on page 4 through 5, and At First, which is on page 8 through 9. Look at the third stanza of At First. So, and At First, on page 8 through 9, I want you to pay attention to that third stanza. And I want you to stop and jot. What new meaning on page 8 and 9 do you notice in the way Josh values his nickname in At First? So in other words, how does Josh see his nickname in At First, which is on page 8 through 9? And how does that differ with the way he sees his nickname in Josh Bell on page 4 through 5? So the first thing that you're going to need to do in order to answer this question effectively is you need to go to page 4 and 5, Josh Bell, which is the poem Josh Bell, and you're going to read that poem and see how he talks about his nickname. How does he feel about his nickname in page 4 through 5? And then I want you to flip over and go to page 8 through 9, and I want you to read in there and tell me, how do you think he feels about his nickname there? Then I want you to look at what you wrote for each one. How are they different? How does he see his nickname in the poem Josh Bell as opposed to At First? So far, guys, we've been doing a lot of examining. And we've been looking at the ways that basketball, Josh's nickname, which is what we just did, and his hair all seem to shape his sense of self and his world, or who he thinks he is. So, what do these three things have in common? How do they build his sense of self? How do they build who he is? Think about what you wrote about the person that is most important to you and how they shape your sense of self or your world. So in other words, how does basketball shape who Josh is? What does it add to him? What characteristics does it give him? What does it show us about what type of person he is? What does his nickname tell us about his sense of self? And what does his hair tell us about his sense of self? Please drop those answers and those comments inside of the discussion board, guys, so that we can make sure that we get as many examples as possible. It's always good to learn from one another. So in our next here, we're going to do jigsaw activity. And we've done this before. Each of you will be assigned a poem from the crossover and a series of questions that will help you deeply look into the characters' relationships. I will post these poems inside of Schoology along with the poem that you're going to be looking at and answering questions for. You will find this assignment in Schoology. Using your completed copies of handout 5A, and this is going to be in your student notebook, I want you to write a paragraph explaining how a family member shapes Josh's sense of himself and his world. Include in your paragraph one way that this relationship has developed in the novel, and explain how and why it has changed or is changing using text evidence. This is an essay, so I'm looking for more than 5 to 6 sentences in order for you to be very detailed. Remember that we just answered a question that was very similar to this when I asked you to tell me about an important person in your life and how they shaped who you are. Now I want you to find a particular family member in Josh's life and how it shapes who he is. If you need to pause here, now is the time to take a moment and stop. I'm definitely not mad because I know the face here looks a little angry. But this is a moment for you to stop and go and complete the assignment that we just spoke about. If not, you can continue moving on with me into the next steps. So now, guys, if we've done our homework, we've already read these poems. Well, now I want us to really focus on these poems. The Crossover, which is on page 29, Calamity, which is on page 39, Palatitinus, which is on 48 through 49, and Hypertension, which is on 76. We are going to reread these poems together. And then we're going to analyze. So when you guys read these poems to yourselves, I want you to look at the poems, how they look like on paper. And I want you to tell me what are some characteristics or what characteristics do all of these poems share? What characteristics do all of these 4 poems share? You can pause here if you would like to look at these poems and then meet me back here at the same video. So, one thing that these poems share is, for instance, they are what's called a definition poem. They are a definition poem. They use a word separated by syllables as the title. So they take one word and they separate that word into syllables, and that's the title. The subtitle has phonetic, spelling, and word type. They have 4 stanzas. The first stanza is the dictionary definition of the word, and the next 3 stanzas are examples of the word in context and demonstrate the themes of the poem. The next 3 stanzas all start with as in, the words as in. And it represents a reflective mode the speaker deeply considers the subject. So these are some of the things that you should have noticed about all 4 of these poems and what they had in common. So let's think. If an entire poem is focused on a definition of a word, what might the larger purpose of the poem be? What might the larger purpose of the poem be if the poem is about the definition of this word? So what that kind of tells me is that I'm probably going to have to look up these words in the dictionary to see what they mean in order to be able to answer this question, guys. But the first thing I want to talk about is what is the definition of the word definition? A definition is a statement that explains a word, a phrase, or an idea. So in other words, what I want you to tell me here is what are these poems about and what's happening inside of these poems. This will be inside of the discussion board as well. So let's look at the final stanza in our assigned poem. This is my example that I'm going to use for you to give you an example of some clarity on what it is that we're doing. So I'm going to use the poem Calamity, okay? And in case you guys forgot, Calamity is on page 39. Page 39. So I'm going to go to page 39, and I'm going to look at the final stanza. And the final stanza says, "What a calamity," she says, shaking her head, and telling Dad to take me to the barbershop on Saturday to have the rest cut off. So here, I already know that she's talking about hair, and I already know that she's talking about having him go and cut it off. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to look up the word calamity, okay? I'm going to look up the word calamity. And when I looked up the word calamity, and I'm just going to type this real time with you guys so that you can see what this word means. When I looked up the word calamity, it showed me a lot about what this poem was going to be about. So for example, a calamity is an event causing great and often sudden damage or distress. In other words, a disaster. So when I look at this last stanza, she says, what a calamity. So in other words, what a disaster. She says, shaking her head and telling Dad to take me to the barbershop on Saturday to have the rest cut off. So this right here, when I look at this final stanza, even though the whole poem is named Calamity, it makes me feel like this is about how much of a disaster his hair looks. Maybe it's unkept, or he hasn't really, he's been letting it grow wild, and so it's all over the place, and his mom wants him to kind of tidy his hair up a little bit. And so she uses calamity as a way to describe his hair as a disaster. Again, my example was on page 40 on the last, on that stanza there, this one here. So let's think. Look at your definition poem, the poem that you've been assigned. You can choose another one. And then you're going to compare it to the list poem. Remember, the list poem that we did was on page 14 through 15. So we are going to compare a definition poem, which is what we're just talking about in calamity and hypertension. All of these are definition poems. We're going to compare this to a list poem. How does the definition poem represent a different sense of self for Josh than the list poem that appeared earlier in the novel? In other words, how does Josh see himself in the definition poem versus the list poem? How does he see himself? Does he value himself in one and not in the other? Does he see himself as a rock star and full of talent, but not necessarily in the other? How does he see himself in both of the poems in comparison? After you guys have done that, and it's going to be in a discussion board, I want you to write about a character. And it's going to be an essay, and the assignment link is in Schoology. I want you to write a paragraph explaining how a family member or a family relationship shapes Josh's sense of himself and his world. I want you to include evidence by describing one way that this relationship has developed in the novel, explaining how and why it has changed or is changing. So once again, we're writing a paragraph explaining how a family relationship shapes Josh's sense of himself and his world. All right. If you need to pause here, now is a good time, and then you can meet me back here for the rest of the lesson. All right, guys, so now for our vocabulary deep dive, and we are going to be having a vocabulary deep dive every day after our lessons. I'm sure you've been noticing this in the last 4 lessons. So our vocabulary deep dive for today, we're going to start off with a discussion. Why do we ask questions? Why do we ask questions? You're going to put this in the discussion board that's going to be inside of Schoology. So I want you guys to look at the last lines of the poem that's on page 55. What do you notice about the structure of a sentence that uses the interrogative verb mood? So if you go and look at the last lines of this poem on page 55, I want you to ask yourself, what do you notice about the structure of a sentence that uses the interrogative verb mood? We've talked about the interrogative verb moods before. If you need to go back and review your vocabulary journals, you should have those definitions written down, but they're also in my previous video. But as a quick review, we're going to look at this quick video of interrogative verb mood. What is it? All right, so let's go back to our lesson. In the discussion board, I want you to tell me, what do you notice about the structure of the sentence? So let's look at this sentence. The last line of hypertension in page 76. I think my grandfather died of hypertension. So notice there's a question mark here. And so you may already be trying to think that maybe this is the interrogative verb mood. But this one is a little different. This is actually written in the indicative mood. How can we tell? Well, one thing is, just because there's a question mark at the end of the sentence doesn't always guarantee that it's interrogative verb mood, or that it's actually physically asking a question. So here he says, I think my grandfather died of hypertension. Is that a question? Is he really asking someone? No. If you look at the words I think, this is the indicative mood. The subject he's talking about, or what the sentence is about, is his grandfather. And the predicate is the part of the sentence containing a verb that states something about the subject. So this is the verb died, which is the predicate of the grandfather. So now I want you to look at this sentence. We've already decided that it's not in the interrogative mood. It's in the indicative mood. Now I want you to write this sentence, I think my grandfather died of hypertension. Write this sentence in the interrogative verb mood and share out in the discussion board. All right, that's it. I hope you guys had a wonderful day. Again, once and always, I'm always available for office hours. If you need any help with anything, please do not hesitate to ask. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.